It's cool? Okay. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the panel Reinterpreting Global Knowledge through Subaltern Epistemologies. This is a core group of emerging thinkers at UT Austin working on subaltern thought and different historical projects, which we're going to see through the course of this panel. I must say this is the first university I've ever worked at where everything happens on time. So we will try and continue with this honored tradition at UT. Our first speaker will be Abikal Borah, Immoral Relations, Violence in the Tea Plantations of 19th Century Assam from 1860 to 1900.
Okay. The theme of this panel is basically about reinterpreting global knowledge through subaltern epistemologies. My paper does not really talk about subaltern epistemologies, but rather this paper talks about the conditions of subalternity and how those conditions of subalternity produces certain critiques about universalizing practices when it comes to law and justice. Let me first begin by explaining the context from within which I'm speaking. At the turn of the 18th century, increasing consumption of Chinese tea in Britain led to the foundation of British tea industry in South Asia. Between 1830s and 1860s, the English East India Company regime successfully located certain locations in South Asia and specifically in Assam, where the plant was indigenous to the region. However, founding the tea industry in Assam was not an easy task. During the early years of colonization, Assam was thinly populated and land was abundant in the region. The local peasant tea was dependent on wet rice cultivation, and even after successive attempts by the colonial government, the peasantry refused to work in the tea plantations. As a result, in 1859, the colonial government introduced the indentured labor system through the Workmen's Breach of Contract Act 1859. Soon, 400 laborers were brought into Assam from the northern India, mostly from the areas of Banaras, Ghazipur, Chota Nagpur, and Bihar. In the years to follow, the numbers increased, and in 1867-68, 22,800 indentured laborers migrated to Assam. By 1901, this number reached 645,000. Now, like any other colonial plantation economy, the migrant laborers in the tea plantations of Assam were ruthlessly exploited. The contemporary commentators of violence against the tea plantation workers identified the indentured labor system in Assam as a disguised form of slavery. Subsequently, this has been a much discussed topic in South Asian historiography of labor and law. However, the hitherto existing critiques of colonial labor regimes in Assam pay little attention to the question of violence. Violence, if at all, appears in the historiography of the region, is discussed in its physical form. So the systemic violence that went into the making of the labor regime remains unexplained. Furthermore, such historiographical absence constitutes a symbolic violence at the level of representation and allows its effect to permeate into the practice of writing histories of colonialism. This paper responds to that historiographical absence by posing a critique of conventional labor and legal histories. My paper basically asks three different questions. Firstly, why is it necessary to recognize violence as a force of historical change while we analyze colonial political economy? Secondly, how do the process of instituting labor laws in the colonial context problematize the Eurocentric criticism of law instituting violence? I asked this question specifically with respect to Walter Benjamin. And finally, how do the examples of colonial labor regimes in the global south problematize the 19th century transnational anti-slavery rhetoric of the global north? Now, before I cite specific examples of violence, let me first explain the administrative structure through which the management of the tea plantations were operated. On top of this strategically designed hierarchical structure were the tea companies with their headquarters in London and the managing agents in Calcutta. To facilitate the operations of the tea companies, there was an institutionalized apex body, namely the Indian Tea Association, which was constituted by senior executives of tea companies and retired Indian civil servant officers. The Indian Tea Association functioned both as a lobby for the industry in the corridors of power and as a planner and implementer for its strategies of production, organization, and labor policies in the tea plantations. Furthermore, this structure was supported by the tea industry's social and political connections with the colonial authority to influence the policy of labor matters. In short, these arrangements of convenience were responsible in shaping up the European planters' attitude towards the laboring masses. Furthermore, the recruitment process of the plantation managers were also based on one's social and cultural capital. Writing in 1880s, George M. Barker, a former tea planter, recalled the recruitment process. When Barker arrived at Calcutta from Wales, he already had a contract signed in London. On his arrival, Barker realized that it would have been useless to travel based on speculations, as there was already a surplus of competent men waiting for the bards and all subordinate positions who were carefully selected on physical grounds in London. However, the recruited managers were not skilled with any specialized knowledge or ability. In 1880s, Chambers Journal published a detailed guide for the intending tea planters. This guide suggested that an individual contemplating a career in the tea industry must recognize the fact that the opportunities were open only to those in a position to bring influence to bear in the right quarters, or the man able and willing to pay a premium for the first 3 years of experience. Thus, possessing a fair amount of social and economic capital was the prerequisite to become a planter. It further suggested that let a man be more or less a jack of all trades with very ordinary skills, and still he can become a plantation manager. What was required of them was to possess sound good sense and dignified farm. I'm just quoting these passages from the report. The man should possess sound good sense and dignified farm and decided manner, because any peevish or nagging spirit had a bad effect on the native laborers. In other words, managing tea plantation was a question of farm and decided manner to control the laboring masses on the basis of social relationships determined by racial supremacy. To conceptualize the making of the colonial labor regimes in the Assam tea plantations, it is useful to remind ourselves of Zizek's term, systemic violence. Zizek has shown us that how we can read violence as a subtext of capitalist political economy. Violence is often sanctioned and regularized in the liberal understanding of capitalism, which is conspicuous in the making of colonial labor regimes, such as the tea industry in Assam. In his critique of capitalist political economy, Zizek argued that both objective and subjective violence are endemic to the very structure of capitalism. It is in the often catastrophic consequences of smooth functioning of economic and political system there lies the systemic violence. Thus, in alignment with Zizek, I would like to argue that in the making of the labor regimes in the colonial tea plantations of Assam, systemic violence operated as a driving force. British colonial government's complicity with the plantation management was nothing but a liberal endorsement of systemic violence. Furthermore, to explain violence as a historical force in the making of plantation labor regime in Assam, we need to review the legal structures through which the whole process of recruitment of laborers was conducted. In 1843, slavery was abolished in India by the British government, but they introduced the Indentured Labor Act in 1859. The general terms and conditions of the Labor Act was that you are hired for 3 years, and after the completion of the 3 years, you either can leave or continue to be there, like continue working in the plantations. However, the system was as such that within the contract itself, though it was a transition from status to contract, the nature of the contract was as such that you are hired for a specific period with certain expectations, and if you fail to produce work on time and what is expected out of you, your relationship suddenly turns into a master-slave relationship. Now, this was going on from 1859 onwards. In 1866, certain reports came from within the colonial administration itself, which clearly suggested that there was enormous amount of violence which is going on against the planters. I'll just specifically point out a case where Lord Cranborne, who was the Secretary of the State, informed the Governor General of India, Sir John Lawrence, about a particular incident in the Dorong district of Assam. Cranbourne wrote, "It is with feelings of no small astonishment and pain that I hear the commission of such inhuman practices by persons of British birth within the territories of, subject to your Excellency's control. It is not my intention at this time to enter on an examination of the judicial proceedings which took place in connection with this case in question, but I may here remark that if the law is not sufficiently severe to counteract the prejudices of race and temptations of commercial enterprise, it must be more stringent." However, nothing happened, and this case was not like this report was not even taken seriously within the colonial administration. Instead, in 1882, during the tenure of Lord Ripon, the Labour Districts Immigration Act 1882 was introduced. The result of the new act was disastrous, as per the 1859 Act, the regular contracts used to be of 3 years. Upon the completion of a term, it could be renewed for another term, but now, after the 1882 Act, the term of contract was increased to 5 years, and it just continued, went on and on till the 1930s. Now, okay. Now, I would just want to raise the last point about the institutionalizing practices of law within this context. And here I want to refer to Walter Benjamin and want to read how he was reading violence in the context of Europe, the practices of law making and law preserving. In his 1921 essay, Critique of Violence, Walter Benjamin explained lawmaking and law preserving violence by assuming that the relations between law and justice is a moral one. However, the empirical evidence of instituting labor laws in the colonial context suggests that the relation between law and justice was anything but moral. In other words, in the colonial world, justice and law entered into an immoral relation where the very practices of lawmaking functioned as a means of violence against the laboring poor. Discussing the dialectic between lawmaking and law-preserving violence, Benjamin had argued that all law-preserving violence endorsed by the state indirectly weakens the law-making violence it represents. But in the colonial context, Benjamin's distinction between law-making and law-preserving violence appears completely unstable, as law as an institution of the modern state was imposed without any law-making violence committed by the subject population under jurisdiction. This fundamental historical difference between post-colonial, post-Enlightenment Europe and the post-colonial conditions must be recognized to conceptualize a critique of violence in the colonial world. Historical context, such as the one that I have explained here, not only defines how conditions of subalternity was created, but it also demands a reconceptualization of universal critiques of law and justice. Thank you.
From 2009 to 2012, I served as a technical monitor for the culture sector of the regional office of UNESCO in San Jose, Costa Rica. I participated in a culture and development mega intervention called Cultural Revitalization and Creative Productive Development on the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. The aim of the program was, quote, to help to reduce inequalities in the human, social, and economic development of these communities through cultural reclamation, productive development, and a deepening of knowledge of tangible and intangible heritage of the indigenous and Afro-descendant populations of the region, which are generally identified as Miskito, Garifuna, Creole, Ulwa, Mayagna, and Rama. The participants of the program understood cultural revitalizations as a daily struggle. They read the enhancement of their cultural expressions as part of their decolonial quest against mestizo, white narratives and dynamics of cultural and racial dominance. This experience challenged my comprehension of how international cooperation works with culture and my own positionality as cultural manager and researcher. Grounded on this experience, I problematized how the execution of cultural revitalization processes, with particular attention to those related to the oral traditions of indigenous and Afro-descendants populations, entail a particular non-Western experience of knowledge production, quote, built upon relationships with things rather than on the things itself, from Sean Wilson. I argue that the reproduction and performance of this knowledge, for this conference, taking the example of the Afro-descendant Creole celebration of the Maypole, has political consequences, linking my assessment to the theorization of the so-called epistemologies of the South and other decolonizing frameworks. Specifically speaking about the example of the Maypole Festival, representatives of the Creole community in the autonomous region of the Atlantic North of Nicaragua and the autonomous region of the Atlantic South of Nicaragua participated in the recovery and enhancement of the Maypole celebration, which is a cultural expression rich in heritage and cultural features because it integrates music, dance, performance, ritual, entertainment, gastronomy, and oral traditions. The research team of the cultural revitalization process dialogued with the elders and documented their knowledge and memories. They organized workshops to promote exchanges between the elderly, youth, and children. These sessions generated debates about the current meaning of Maypole celebration for Creoles and the inhabitants of the Caribbean coast in general. Creole communities of Bluefields and Bilwi are currently facing the dilemma of emergent cultural tourism surrounding the Maypole celebrations that may offer them the opportunity to better their living conditions. However, they are also worried about how market dynamics might affect the significance of the Maypole celebrations, especially if it is Maypole routinely performed on the stages of Managua, the capital of Nicaragua. That is to say, if it is decontextualized. From that perspective, members of the Creole community engage with this cultural revitalization process for establishing a distinction between private Maypole celebration and the public sale of products associated with the cultural tradition that may generate income for the community. According to the team of Creole researchers, I quote, younger Creole generations are participating in a self-consciousness process of being blacks within their private spheres. Their cultural awareness is nourished by the accounts of the elders who, during the celebraciones de barrio, quarter celebrations, narrate the origin of the festivity. The elders insist on the current value of the myths and foundational beliefs that inform the Maypole celebration. Specifically, the recognition of Mother Earth as the origin of all the goods for humanity. Legends, stories, songs, and riddles, among other oral traditions, constitute a crucial dimension of the Maypole festivities. Okay, I don't know if you can read this, but this is the voice of Elizabeth Nelson, Miss Lizzie. She's one of the most popular performer and the historical embodied memory of Maypole. And speak about Mayaya as the goddess of fertility and why they call Mayaya as central for Maypole traditions. During the revitalization processes, the subversive character of the practice was referred to constantly. Maypole celebration came to the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua with the British during the 19th century. The colonized populations embraced the practice through mimesis and parody. The same appropriation, adaptation processes that took place within the insular Caribbean and that also informs Maypole celebrations in Bluefields. The transformation and particular experience of the celebration of the masters by the slaves aimed to respond their authority. The Europeanness of the dance and the costumes, the Western myths and rituals associated to Maypole were Africanized, challenging the authority of the Anglo culture over the domestic spaces and bodies of the Black population. The performance of Maypole celebration was then, and it is still, considered as an act of resistance. As a celebration in the private sphere, it is evoked as an experience of the diasporic Afro-descendant community. Later, Maypole celebrations moved from the house patios internal to the street external, from one warrior to the next. In that sense, it becomes a celebration of Blackness and of the communitarian values of the Creole people within the public sphere. Yeah, please. That's another testimony. That's Miss Lizzie and how the celebration goes to the streets. From a dynamic and transformative perspective, the cultural revitalization of the Maypole celebration embodies a rereading of what it means to be African descendant in the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua. The festivities introduce Blackness in public and private space, both symbolically and physically. When performers and spectators are familiar with the oral traditions that explains the origins and cultural meaning of the celebration, another understanding of the relationship between human and nature arises. Participants recognize an act that honors life and builds solidarity. The parade, costume, dance, songs, and artistic performance function together as a Black epistemological experience. Conclusion. The challenge of the participants of the cultural revitalization processes was to validate their knowledge, regularly labeled as folkloric or local, traditional, alternative, or peripheral. Quote, the will of cultural revitalization, as well as the persistence of oral traditions throughout the indigenous and Afro-descendants community of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua, demonstrates the viability of an indigenous knowledge contesting Western epistemologies. In addition, they serve as a form of cultural resistance that rearticulates the South as a locus of enunciation and as a site of agency and political transformation for non-passive subaltern populations. On one hand, the revitalization process became a space for contesting the structural racism of institutions and for masking the paternalistic and colonial approach of international cooperation agencies, something that I engage more in my paper. On the other hand, they became a space for the ecology of knowledge. Epistemologies of the South within the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua were inevitably contesting relations of power and reaching other answers, because what cannot be said or said clearly in one language or culture may be said and said clearly in another language or culture. Thank you.
This presentation is based on my ongoing work on Ifa-Orisha religion as a through the transdisciplinary field of African and African diaspora studies, and seeks to examine how transnational communities of Orisha worshipers on 3 different continents create transcendent communities in order to confront the realities of living and surviving in a global context of Black genocide and epistemicide. U.S. Black feminist and Afro-pessimist scholar Joy James defines transcendent community as one that, quote, acknowledges ancestors as a political spiritual resource, and she adds that, quote, speeches about ancestors enable critical appraisals of historical oppression and establishes communal ties to support and reflect political, spiritual, secular, sacred traditions and practices. Ancestors illuminate an avenue for liberation, and this transcendent community is thought to extend through time and space and includes ancestors as well as the present collective and future unborn children, end quote. In order to come to a holistic understanding of the radical political potential of Orisha-based religions and other Black, Atlantic, and African American religious practices, It is necessary to heed M. Jackie Alexander's call to, quote, take the sacred seriously, end quote, by privileging the ancestral, embodied, and erotic forms of knowledge that create and sustain communities guided by African spiritual ontologies that fundamentally complicate Western notions of time, space, and self. This approach forces us to study African diaspora religions beyond the often binary categories of cultural retentions versus inventions, categories which tend to dominate academic analyses of Orisha worship today. It allows us to instead concentrate on the everyday and quotidian settings in which communities of practitioners create and sustain strategies for survival, healing, knowledge production, and grassroots political organizing. This work is written from the point of view of a neophyte who began in the Bahian Orisha tradition of Candomblé Nago and later became a practitioner and initiate of multiple priesthoods within the Cuban Orisha Lukumi system. The experiences presented in the larger written work have been gathered over a decade of personal lessons learned at the feet of both elder priests and the Orishas themselves. These encounters have taken place in locales such as Salvador de Bahia, Chicago, Havana, Miami, New York, and Puerto Rico. I explain how Orisha epistemology and priestly initiations have produced epistemic breaks and shifts in my own consciousness, which promoted me to reflect on the influence of the nation state in my own life and intellectual development. This in turn led me to interrogate how the nation state has shaped my various religious communities and leads me to question my own positionality in the relationship between Orisha worshipers and the academy, two worlds in which I now have personal stake. Although the larger project is an autoethnographical one, for today's presentation, I wish to simply frame the theoretical and methodological approach that I employ in relation to politically subversive Black Atlantic epistemologies of the sacred. Essentially, my theoretical intervention is that Black Atlantic religions such as Orisha worship can be framed as a decolonial practice, a designation that requires a clear definition since the term decolonization is used in different ways in different contexts by various authors, and the term decoloniality is not the same thing as decolonization. As it pertains to methodology, I argue that an intersectional Black feminist method is a useful approach to the study of Black Atlantic religions that has gone underutilized until now, especially by scholars who primarily concentrate on issues of cultural authenticity and syncretism. Coloniality and decoloniality are terms employed by a group of scholars belonging to what is known in the literature as the modernity coloniality paradigm, a theoretical tradition that is still in formation but shares a similar intellectual genealogy with the Latin American lines of subaltern and post-colonial studies. Nelson Maldonado Torres provides a straightforward distinction between coloniality and colonization when he notes that, quote, colonialism denotes a political and economic relation in which the sovereignty of a nation or people rests on the power of another nation, which makes such nation an empire. Coloniality, instead, refers to the long-standing patterns of power that emerge as a result of colonialism, but that today define culture, labor, intersubjective relations, and knowledge production well beyond the limits of colonial administration. Thus, coloniality survives colonialism. So the definition of a colonial intellectual of a decolonial intellectual, spiritual, or political project is one that, quote, confronts the racial, gender, and sexual hierarchies that were put in place and strengthened by European modernity as it colonized and enslaved populations throughout the planet, end quote. So to critique modernity without reproducing the knowledge, the logics of the colonizer, and to avoid what Audre Lorde calls the oppressor within, decolonial projects are those that are grounded in the subjectivities and knowledge-producing capacities of colonized groups themselves, which is a major tenet of various feminist traditions of the Global South. Scholars such as Maria Lugones, Marcel Maes-Cohen, and Agustin Laumontes have noted that the modernity coloniality paradigm shares much theoretical common ground with the theories of transnational third-world feminisms in general, but U.S. Black and queer feminisms in particular. This is because they both, quote, see colonial power as a complex pattern that integrates class exploitation, capital accumulation with ethno-racial, cultural epistemic, and gender sexual domination. In other words, they both analyze hierarchies of power through an intersectional approach, yet in a manner that highlights an often unarticulated fact, which is that genocide is most often accompanied by epistemicide. This means that apart from the many structural overlapping oppressions that continuously facilitate Black death, racial capitalism being only one example, coloniality entails epistemicide because it is intent on suppressing and eliminating forms of knowledge production that are undertaken outside of the dominant structures, such as within the westernized university in its commitment to scientific rationality and the myth of objectivity. In this work, I aim to highlight that these theoretical connections between the modernity coloniality paradigm and US Black and queer feminisms also extends into the realm of the methodological. Both of these schools of thought resituate the object of colonial and neo-colonial domination as the primary subject of knowledge production. Thus, a basic tenet of decolonial methodology, or what Nelson Maldonado Torres calls a decolonial attitude, that is shared by both schools and is intent on, quote, with a focus on making the invisible visible through the critical reflections of the invisible people themselves, end quote. Yet when we apply this attitude to the study of Black Atlantic religions, Black and queer feminist methodologies become even more crucial interventions because, as Orisha priest and scholar M. Jackie Alexander argues, quote, all of the elements with which feminism has been preoccupied, including transnationalism, gender and sexuality, experience, history, memory, subjectivity, and justice, are contained within a metaphysic that uses spirit knowing as the mechanism of making the world intelligible, end quote. Joy James further solidifies this connection when she states that, quote, a theory of African ancestors and communal development exists as a coda for Black feminisms. The prominence of storytelling and activism in Black feminism reflects traditional African cosmology, where thinkers in service to community travel full circle to realize metaphysical ideals in the physical realm. Finally, this perspective is important because the majority of initiates and leaders and priests of Black Atlantic religions in both history and the present have been and are Black women. Even in highly patriarchal Black Atlantic religious systems, the legitimacy of spiritual political leadership is often predicated upon African concepts of divine feminine power, as well as the day-to-day physical and spiritual labor of Black women. As far as applied research method goes, I center the nation state as a fundamental product of the modern colonial world system and examine how Orisha worshippers critique, selectively engage with, or disengage from various assumptions of modernity that include but are not limited to the primacy of capitalism, accumulative capitalism, white supremacy, patriarchy, binary understandings of gender, heteronormativity, individualism, European biomedicine, and religious/philosophical monotheism. My main focus is to interrogate how the philosophies, ritual systems, aesthetic traditions, and political projects of transnational communities of Orisha worshippers are capable of theorizing complex understandings of how power operates in rhetoric as opposed to practice. Thus, I draw from historical, theological, ethnographic, cultural, literary, musical, and bodily archives in order to get a sense of the different modes of knowing that African diasporic adherents employ in order to make sense of their lived realities and their relationship to the nation state within the context of their spiritual practice. Following M. Jackie Alexander again, some of the specific questions that can be answered when we examine how African cosmologies informed everyday and lived experiences include the following, quote, how is a sacred interior cultivated, and how does it assist practitioners in the task of making themselves intelligible to themselves? And how does spiritual work produce the conditions that bring about the realignment of the self with the self, which is simultaneously a realignment of oneself with the divine through a collectivity? These questions lead us to foreground practice through which the sacred becomes a way of embodying and remembering the self, a self that is neither habitually individuated nor unwittingly secularized, end quote. However, in order to meet the expectations for the levels of self-reflexivity and openness about oneself that is now characteristics of the work of Black feminist writers, it becomes impossible to ask these questions about any group of interlocutors without first asking and answering these questions as they pertain to my own positionality as a university-educated, white Latino heterosexual male. This means accounting for my own voice and personal motives for undertaking this project in the first place, starting by retelling how I encountered Orisha religion in my own youth as a teenager. And this in turn requires treating the Orishas and ancestors themselves as more than just metaphorical or imagined figures who provide us with parables upon which to live. Instead, these spirits must be treated as literal, sentient, and active members and active characters in the story of undoing coloniality on an everyday basis. Thank you.
Now about a fairly recent wave of bombings in Dahiyeh, which is the southern suburbs of Beirut, Lebanon. These occurred in, for roughly from fall 2013 to spring, winter 2014. But first, I'll situate Beirut for you. The streets of the city that bear such a long witness to factional politics in Lebanon also bear witness, or directly in the day-to-day experience, show these factional politics through flags of the numerous political parties most linked to a confessional community that dominates a particular neighborhood. In Dahiyeh, the signs are frequently joined by what you see here, which are banners celebrating martyrs killed in action against Israeli forces, or more recently in the Syria conflict. In this way, even as people move about the city, they see the signs of the divisions that dominate the geography of the country as a whole. But in order to understand Beirut's role more generally as the capital of Lebanon without overlooking the areas of differences inherent within the city, it is helpful to frame what constitutes Lebanese unity within a larger discourse about nationalism. So analyzed through the lens of Benedict Anderson's work, defining nationalist sentiment as the systematic creation of an imagined community, it's a bit difficult to conceive of a distinctly Lebanese nationalism due to the divisions created by such confessional politics and the sectarianism that has come to delineate society in Lebanon following the Civil War. Instead, the model that helps to grasp the seemingly contradictory notion of Lebanese unity in the face of these perceived differences, and eventually what I'll get to in the face of these attacks, is that of Partha Chatterjee's fragmented nationalism. So in place of the iterations of anti-colonial nationalism Chatterjee sees developing in India before the end of the British Raj there, Lebanon's fragments occur within the nation itself between communities that still exist within the framework of the state. There are, however, limits to the sectarian divide that are recognized by the diverse range of groups in Lebanon and manifested in sentiments of unity, particularly in the face of tragedy. This makes it possible to conceive of the country, and by extension, its capital, as inherently fragmented by communal divisions on the one hand, and still a site of imagined nationalism on the other. Sectarianism is a system of patronage determined by historical socioeconomic differences that has come to define geopolitical identities, especially in the capital itself. It's also entrenched in the confessional political system established under the National Pact in 1943, which requires citizens to vote according to their religious identity and allots certain powers to different groups. The tenuous unity of Lebanon, deeply divided along sectarian lines, but committed to a shaky truce established at the end of the Lebanese Civil War in 1991, has in the past given way to division along the lines of these underlying fragmentations in the face of trauma, and various communities have exceeded what I would argue are borders created around them by the confessional state. As more horror is unleashed on one community, the spatial barriers between it and the other groups also become more well-defined, whether by way of physical security checkpoints or social imaginaries, in line with the work of Arjun Appadure. Throughout this presentation, though, I'll use sectarianism to indicate these imagined communal differences that historically have been grounded in socioeconomic disparities more than doctrinal divisions. And there are officially 17 religions in Lebanon that recognized by the Constitution. The greatest barrier over the past 2 decades since the end of the war has been that between the suburbs in South Beirut and the rest of the city. You may have heard of the suburbs as Hezbollah's stronghold. It's a historic and official line separating central Beirut and its southern suburbs that defies the usual dichotomy of metropolis as core and marginal community as periphery, which is what I really hope to question in this presentation. In the century or so of their existence, these southern suburbs, and Dahiyeh is the word for suburb in Arabic, have been divided from Beirut by a municipal boundary and entrenched geographic sectarianism informed by the standard narrative of the movement of impoverished Shia from rural South Lebanon to the capital's urban fringes. In recent decades, this division has been reinforced by Dahiyeh's protected status under the control of militant political group Hezbollah. However, when a series of car bombings linked to the war in neighboring Syria and predominantly targeting sites in Dahiyeh began in summer 2013, popular response in Lebanon underscored this perceived divide in the country between city and suburb, and at the same time undermined it by emphasizing unity in the face of such attacks. Conventional media coverage, opinion pieces, social media campaigns, and public discourse of the bombings that began in July 2013 and culminated with 7 separate attacks in January and February of 2014 presented substantial challenges to the common conception of the southern suburbs as a separate from Beirut in the Lebanese consciousness. So I hope to explore popular discourse about Dahiyeh as both distinct from and a piece or a part of Beirut throughout this period of turmoil, and as expressed in Arabic and English press coverage and social media activity. Just a note on the geography. So the cluster of neighborhoods south of Beirut city limits and makes up the distinctive geographic entity of the southern suburbs falls under the jurisdiction of 4 distinct municipal districts, which are from the northern border, where it says Frenechabek, there's a roundabout called Tayoune, which is in the district of Tawitat al-Ghazir. Moving down, you have Shia, Roberi, Haret Hrek, and Berge Brejne. And these, well, just situating geographically, but what distinguishes these municipalities are the same as other municipalities bordering downtown Beirut. However, what distinguishes the southern suburbs from those to the east along the foothills of Mount Lebanon are the political and economic disparities, more so than any sort of official recognized legal differentiations. Since the end of the civil war in Lebanon, these suburbs have been associated with a distinctly Shia character. And following the Civil War, during the Civil War, there was a general crystallization of sectarian division geographically throughout the city. But the 1990s represented sort of a decade of normalizing relations between the core and its periphery, between Beirut and the southern suburbs, which had been more polarized during the war, culminating with the Israeli withdrawal from South Lebanon in 2000, which was heralded throughout the country as a victory for both Hezbollah and Lebanon. So during the war, you saw a lot more division along sectarian lines geographically. After the war, there was more of an effort for reintegration. However, the perceived sectarian character of these neighborhoods remained. After the withdrawal of Israel's struggles for power over the direction of the post-war country would take led ultimately to volatile unrest and the establishment of 2 camps within the government, March 14th, which is largely seen as more friendly to the West and the Gulf states, and March 8th, which was the group of political parties dominated by Hezbollah itself. And there were arguments over Syrian occupation, Hezbollah's right to retain arms. But this is all important for the way that we analyze the media coverage in Lebanon, which largely breaks down between these 2 groups of parties. So on April 30th, 2013, Hezbollah's leader, moving forward, Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah, announced what many Lebanese had long suspected, that his group was engaged fighting on the side of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad in the neighboring country's war, and had been for several months. Syria's civil war, which grew out of peaceful protests inspired by the popular Arab Spring movements throughout the region in April 2011, at this time pitted Assad's beleaguered regime forces against a growing number of Islamist militant groups and the Western-backed Free Syrian Army. This is largely the admittal of Nasrallah that Hezbollah was fighting in Syria is largely what led to Dahiyeh being targeted as a site of Hezbollah's dominance. And the coverage of it broke down along these recognized lines within the Arabic media. Most newspapers have admitted the affiliation with one party or the other. So I've just realized I'm quite low on time. So the division between the 2 parties can be seen in comparison of the coverage of the traumatic events by the 2 leading Arabic newspapers in the country. With the largest number of subscribers, these publications represent the most mainstream coverage of current events, especially in contrast to other newspapers that were founded by and served directly as the mouthpiece for particular political parties. However, like most things in Lebanese society, they're not without some declared bias. Moving forward beyond some of the ways that the bombings were specifically covered, I'll just skip ahead to the end a bit and say that, a common trend in both the coverage of both sort of groups of publications associated with the 2 divided sides within Lebanese politics is an attempt to make sense of the scene on the ground and the lives of the victims through both first-person narratives written by residents of Dahiyeh and commentaries with highly descriptive rhetoric about the neighborhoods targeted. Articles were written from the chaos immediately following the attacks, as well as well as stories of the lives of those who died, but also more mundane tales of life returning to the southern suburbs, such as an account of a couple married among the rubble. Many articles following the bombings focused on the fear and anxiety felt by residents who go back to their lives after each bombing as if nothing happened, with time continuing to pass naturally while they wait for the next death, which is inevitable. And that's a quote from an article in my own judgment. The two major Lebanese papers reported on mothers who refused to send their children to school for fear they would never return, and businessmen who had developed their own protocol for assessing the threat of cars parked in front of their offices, often directly asking their readers what they would do in the face of such difficulties. In this way, the suburbs were normalized, and those citizens who lived there humanized through a consideration of the everyday life there. The area became more than just a backward slum, which is how it had been depicted sort of in previous times, with a death count in place of a population. Though this coverage may have served to spread understanding of the daily lives and suffering of those who lived in the southern suburbs, the task itself was informed by the popularly conceived difference between Dahiyeh and central Beirut. The newspapers also ran articles that addressed the existential question of what it is to be a resident in Dahiyeh in the days following the attacks. While the side affiliated with March 14th and this is the media representative of that party, presented special literary pieces that often focused on the sectarian divide and death in southern suburbs. The side affiliated with March 8th, that is the political parties closely related to Hezbollah, instead featured the accounts of younger writers struggling with the stereotype of the suburbs in the media and popular consciousness. Often writing in the first person, these articles highlighted the voice of Lebanese from the suburbs who were grappling to deal with the reality that they were the target of such attacks and thus different from those Lebanese living in municipal Beirut who were not facing the same threat of violence. The area that defined them and set their social standing in the eyes of others was associated now with the preference of death over life. By those same others, and these writers sought to find harmony between this violence and the neighborhoods they called home, where no one was a stranger. Not strictly news, these pieces I've just cited still treat the divide between Dahiyeh and the rest of Beirut within the framework of the nation. They emphasize this boundary as indicative of different sectarian identities, with the Lebanese Shia of Dahiyeh navigating their role as an other to the Lebanese of central Beirut. However, the fact that the two largest newspapers in the country would address these issues, and therefore that the conversation would be spread throughout Lebanon, also reveals the nationalism inherent in this project, as well as the itinerary of recognition through assimilation of the other, appropriated and integrated into the logic of self, as posited by Spivak.
Thank you. So I will be talking about this novel written by Kateb Yacine, kind of taking a literary approach to Subaltern Epistemologies. When discussing his much lauded first novel, Nedjma, Kateb Yacine called it an Algerian work in Arabic, even though the novel was written and published in French. Kateb was not the only one to emphasize the profoundly Algerian nature of his work. In the preface to the first edition of the novel, an anonymous Les Éditeurs promised that though the novel was, quote, conçu et écrit en français, Nedjma reste une œuvre profondément arabe. Both characterizations emphasize not only the unique Algerian viewpoint, but also a linguistic disconnect between the French in which the novel was written and the Arabic of the world it sought to represent. The question of translation bubbles to the surface of every page. The monolingual French reader will encounter over 40 different Arabic or Arabic origin words or expressions, most of which are left undefined. The presence of foreign words, coupled with the absence of meaning, create an alienating experience for the monolingual reader. There is an entire level of signification that is impossible to decipher or understand without significant study of the language and culture. The novel itself follows the lives of 4 young Algerian men during and after the Sétif massacres in 1945, chronicling their friendship as well as their collective sexual fascination with the beautiful young woman, Nedjma. There are many scenes of colonial violence, from mistreatment of laborers to imprisonment for disobedience to murder and torture of Algerians at the hand of frequently the French government. The resulting world in Nedjma is chaotic. Characters who are simultaneously victims and aggressors in constant motion between cities, entering and escaping prison, trying to find their place in the disorder. Critics have credited this chaos to the stelliform cyclical structure of the novel and shown how it draws inspiration from the works of William Faulkner, James Joyce, and the French Nouveau Roman. Paradoxically, Kateb himself never placed much stock in the narrative structure, which he dismissed as a last-minute fluke. To him, the meaning was elsewhere. I argue that the extensive code switching in the novel is far more significant. As critics such as Abdelkabir Katibi would demonstrate decades after the publication of Nedjma, language for Algerians was never so simple as French versus Arabic. To reduce their linguistic identity to a struggle between these two languages is to miss the reality of extensive cultural and linguistic interchange between the two languages and, by extension, culture. And it should be said, it should never be seen quite as such a binary French-Arabic. Long before Katibi, Kateb represents this reality by refusing to confine his novel to a single language. More importantly, by refusing to pick sides, he refuses an artificial binary between these two cultures. For the bilingual or polylingual speaker, language is fluid. Though the narration of the novel is filled with violent episodes, the harmony between French and Arabic in the novel counterbalances this violence by suggesting a path of reconciliation. For the Maghrebi writer, language is especially fraught. The challenge for the Maghrebi writer is not, in critic Reda Ben-Smia's words, quote, that of knowing what to say, they were never truly lacking in subject matter, but that otherwise more sensitive question of knowing in what language to write, end quote. This predicament is made all the more complex for Kateb in Algeria, where there was never just one language. Even before French colonization, Algerians spoke both classical and dialectical Arabic, and a host of regional languages, all of which are divided into their own dialects. Thus, the question of which language to write in becomes a question of audience, which does not simplify, but rather complicates the problem. At the time of Algerian independence, for example, 85% of the population neither spoke French nor read or wrote Arabic or French. Even once the Algerian writer chooses a language in which to write, he is still faced with the impossible task of translating a plurilingual society into a monolingual work. As Ben-Smia writes, and I quote, the impossibility of writing in French was at the same time the impossibility of translating the idiosyncratic traits of the society in which they lived into a language of another culture. The problem for these writers was posed within strict bounds. How can we live within several languages and only write in one, end quote. Kateb was acutely aware of the impossibility of choosing one language in which to write, and was deeply frustrated by the dichotomies between French and Arabic that forced writers to choose one language or the other. Before the reader even opens the book or pulls it off the shelf, the simultaneous presence of Arabic and French in the text is already clear from the front cover and spine. The title, Nedjma, is meaningless in French except as the name of the character. This name, however, would evoke a string of additional references to the bilingual reader. While Nedjma is indeed a woman's name, in Arabic, one of its meanings is star, which already unlocks other prominent themes in the novel. The Algerian flag features a star at its center, and Nedjma could reference both the flag and, by extension, the Algerian nation. The name could also be a reference to the first Algerian nationalist party, the North African Star, of which Kateb was a member prior to his joining the Communist Party. Stars figure prominently on the flags of many nations, again suggesting that the novel contains themes of nation building. Following the title, the reader sees the author's name, Kateb Yacine, which might appear odd to the bilingual reader, since Kateb in Arabic means writer, while Yacine is more commonly a male first name. Indeed, Kateb Yacine's birth name is Yacine Kateb. By reversing his first and last name in his pen name, Kateb emphasizes his role as a writer. The word Kateb in Arabic derives from the root kaf ta ba, which, in addition to writer, evokes kitab, book, letter, or scripture, kataba, written, and kitaba, the act or practice of writing. Patrick Crowley suggests that the reversal of the names to create the pen name Kateb Yacine is also evocative of the way in which a French schoolboy might call out his name, last name, first name, in class. He sees the pen name as a reversal of the Arab self through the conventions of the French school system. Crowley suggests that the reversal of names on the cover and the lack of patronymics in the text forces the reader to reinterrogate the relationship between fact and fiction, especially considering that Nedjma is loosely autobiographical. Taking the formal system of address in Arabic into account, however, can provide an alternate explanation. In Arabic, When addressing someone formally, one employs their title, in Kateb's case, Kateb, followed by their first name. In this sense, Kateb's pen name is possibly more true to his Arab background, as it causes his French audience to address him with the formal system employed in Arabic instead of that of the French. Kateb continues code switching past the cover of the novel by peppering his text with Arabic words, some examples of which you can see on this slide. With the exception of the few footnoted expressions, most of the transliterated Arabic words and expressions are presented without comment. They are simply part of the text, no different from the French words that precede and follow them. Their very presence foregrounds the impossibility of translating a bilingual reality. The use of Arabic words can also serve to highlight or differentiate certain spaces, as is the case with Rashid, who takes refuge in a funduk upon returning from his failed pilgrimage with Si Mukhtar. In the funduk, Rashid grows increasingly dependent on drugs, and it becomes a space that he does not wish to leave, a simultaneous refuge of comfort and representation of claustrophobic imprisonment. While his friends find themselves locked in prison cells, Rashid has locked himself in the hashish-filled haze of the funduk. Funduk, which is a French word derived from Arabic, refers to a hotel or trading spot, especially for merchants. It is meant for travelers as a halfway point between destinations, not the destination itself. The funduk is also a profoundly Arab space, one that is particular to North Africa. By enclosing Rashid in this Arab space, where he finds himself wasting away on drugs and hallucinations, Kateb is showing the effects of the destructive environment in which the Algerian youth find themselves. Kateb uses the word funduk because it is a space that has no translatable equivalent. While he could have called it a hotel or a traveler's stop, that would have obscured its links to North African history and culture. Using the Arabic-derived word gives him a freedom to express the world as it was, creating a space where Arab culture could exist in the French language without one being destroyed or overtaken by the other. Kateb repeatedly returns to the idea that the divisions between the French and Arabic language are artificial, and that the languages, and by extension the cultures, share many attributes. In one of Mustafa's many journal entries, we read about a merchant who is lecturing about the shared commonalities between Arabic and French. And I quote, "Il faut bien dire que le vocabulaire français comprend 251 mots d'origine arabe. Nous aussi, nous influençons leur civilisation." In other words, the French vocabulary contains 251 words of Arabic origin. We also influence their civilization. Later, a footnote reminds the readers that Algeria was initially called El Jazair in Arabic, before it became l'Algérie in French. Thus, and I quote, "La racine arabe persiste dans le vocable français," or the Arab root persists in the French term. Both represent instances of pushing back from Arabic to French. Despite the myth created by the West that Arab cultures did not influence theirs at all, there are still linguistic traces that indicate that this must not have been the case. Kateb does not just seek the correspondences between French and Arabic, he also strives to foreground the connections within the Arab world itself. When describing the origins of the Kiblut tribe, Si Mukhtar explains to Rashid that the name of even this profoundly Arabic tribe, Algerian tribe, is not Arabic in origin, And I quote, "Prends le mot corde et traduis. Tu auras rebelle en arabe. Il n'y a que le K au lieu du H initial et l'altération de la syllabe finale qui différencie le mot turc du mot arabe, à supposer que ce soit bien un nom turc." In other words, if you take the word for cord and you translate, you get an Arabic word, and there's only the difference of one letter, basically, and the change of the final syllable that create this differentiation between the Turkish word and the Arabic word. And I must conclude very quickly now. Kind of lost track of time there. So basically, this speaks to a larger idea of the bilingual author or the polylingual speaker trying to translate into a monolingual word. And so while Nedjma is still largely a monolingual text written within French, Kateb is clearly struggling with the limits of the language, the parts that are still impossible to translate. Just as Khatibi would decades later, Kateb reached for other languages beyond French, Arabic, and English that could describe that which was untranslatable. In so doing, Kateb is already rejecting the binary between French and Arabic. While he may have been compelled to write in French, he could not let one language completely dominate the other. The Arabic phrases peek through the text, leaving silences for the monolingual reader, pieces of a world that can never be fully translated or understood, except to the bilingual reader who has lived in the same world. While there is undeniable tension between the French and Arab people in the novel, language is not presented as an us versus them dichotomy. Instead, the connections between languages and the historical overlaps between cultures are emphasized. Long before Khatibi and his bilingual love story in Amour bilingue, Kateb asked why he was forced to choose between the two languages and why that choice had to be Manichaean. His work theorized a liminal space between languages, a space where a French language novel could truly be an Algerian text written in Arabic.
Presentation and make in the paper. I argue that utilizing Fanon to interpret colonial health campaigns allows us to re-emphasize physical violence as an analytical object while connecting the prolific literature on metaphysical violence. So the theoretical argument that is more largely portrayed in my paper says that the realms of physical violence and metaphysical violence tend to be seen in modern academia as very detached categories, and so I revisit Fanon to look at the dynamic of colonial violence, specifically in the medical sphere, to look at the ways in which the internalization of violence is then reiterated back in the metaphysical realm and then circles back to the physical, trying to bridge the gap that I see within the literature on colonial violence. So just to give you a brief roadmap, first, I'm going to talk about the analytical categories I'm pulling from Fanon, and then I'm going to frame a spectrum of violence that I think allows us to see both the physical and the metaphysical components. And then I'm going to integrate that into my field of specialization, which is medical history in Africa. And I'm going to do this through a couple of examples from some case studies, and then look at Fanon's ultimate goal, which is to look at indigenous counter-violence as a methodology of liberation, both in this metaphysical and physical realm. So to look at Fanon specifically, I think that especially within the medical sphere, Fanon's arguments about the use of binaries and the identification of the binaries that are a central feature of colonial rhetoric are very useful. So in the medical sphere, the very obvious one is the doctor and the patient. That's a very clear binary that comes up time and time again in any colonial medical histories. I think that secondly, the concept of disciplined violence and the ways in which resistance under Fanon must be articulated in a disciplined manner also helps frame the disciplinary activities of medicine, the regulation of you have to take your pills, you have to check up for every so often, you have to regulate the body within a very disciplined way. So that both helps frame the colonial violence and the counter-violence of resistance to colonial medicine. I think, again, I've spoken to this in kind of my articulation of the general theme, but I mean, one of Fanon's central argument at a third level is the psychological nature of physical violence, and the way it becomes internalized, which is why I find Fanon as an incredibly useful scholar in order to bridge the gap between the physical and the metaphysical in the spectrum of violence. And then ultimately looking at resistance to colonial medicine as resistance through violence, as Fanon recommends. So in looking at the violence spectrum, I argue that despite what the contemporary kind of discourse is, there's obviously an extreme porousness in the barrier between real and symbolic violence, and I argue that they feed back into each other in a cyclical nature. Here, like Abikal, I also rely on Zizek, and I rely on kind of his articulations of objective and subjective violence in detailing real and symbolic violence. So just for a brief outline of Zizek, he argues that objective violence is the background violence that is invisibilized by the rhetoric. So to offer an example that he writes on, when there is a terrorist attack, the objective violence are the conditions that generated the anger behind the terrorist attack. So coloniality could be one of these in terms of historically seeding violence that may be happening. He defines subjective violence as the rhetoric that is put very much so in our face, so the news media that talks about the discourse of terrorism. I actually, in looking at the way in which the rhetoric of violence is occurring in academia in a contemporary sense, flip that dynamic. I argue that because of the segmentation between physical and metaphysical violence in academic discourses, that the physical violence has actually become the objective violence that is invisibilized by an overemphasis on the metaphysical violence without reintegrating it back into the physical realm. And so I find this very useful in terms of analyzing the rhetoric of colonial medicine. So to move into directly applying Fanon to the kind of colonial medicine and the way I'm theoretically framing this. So to look at a couple of examples that I'm pulling through. So we have this, for example, where you have compulsory examinations in the colonial sphere, and this happens all over Africa. You have this examination and treatment, which is a very physical mandate, and it's reinforced by police regimes. But I also rely very heavily on Foucault in his work, Birth of the Clinic, where he illustrates the concept of the gaze, where in order to know the pathology of the individual, you have to strip away the individual, him or herself. You have to strip away the psychology of that individual in order to understand what the physical reality is of disease mapped upon the body. The context of their identity doesn't matter to the colonial doctor. It's only about the physical body. And so I see that as a site of metaphysical violence, but it's coded in a very physical reality of compulsory examination, compulsory vaccination, and the threat of police force if you don't comply with that compulsion as well. And so again, I see this as a very clear example of where the metaphysical and the physical realms of violence intercede with each other. In order to look at the interplay of violence of enforcement, the violence of knowledge, of knowing who is diseased and how that person may be diseased, and the violence of the ontological abstraction, which Foucault gets at, and I don't necessarily have time to go into as much detail about that, all intertwine. And I argue that this relationship is, under Zizek, being constituted as objective violence that we don't notice because of the rhetoric of paying attention only to the metaphysical, as opposed to how we get there and what happens after the metaphysical violence. So to take a couple of brief colonial case studies that I've looked at, I don't have time to go into them all, but we see in general that STD treatment campaigns in colonial Africa, mostly in southern and central Africa, which is my particular areas of study, we see that they become a locus for rhetoric around morality, race policy, the concept of sexualized bodies, and then the policies that result in terms of regulating these systems. So anatomical difference becomes a site for oppression that is very metaphysical and then is enforced by very physical policies that exist. So, for example, syphilis outbreaks in 20th century South Africa, you see that violence begins in the physical realm, where the policy emerges out of doctor's alarm at the increased rates of syphilis, which then is engaged in the Foucauldian process of the gaze, where you diagnose the disease and you map diseases onto identities and populations while simultaneously stripping away those identities and those contexts. And then you see it remanifested in the compulsory campaigns and segregationist policies that emerge. And this was actually seen as what's called the sanitation syndrome in South Africa. And so you see this interplay of the metaphysical and the physical that loop in and out of each other. To take a second example, the Contagious Disease Act in Uganda in the 1920s, we see empirically that entire villages were rounded up and treated, quote unquote, for certain diseases and examined. And you see this interplay where chiefs were actually encouraged by the colonial regime to report medical surveillance. And so there wasn't just a medical surveillance of the colonial realm on the indigenous populations. There was an indirect rule of colonial surveillance that was enforced among the local chiefs. And so again, you see this cyclical dynamic of physical and metaphysical violence that is also looped into the indigenous operations as well via indirect rule. And so, for example, you have these processes where up to 60 women an hour were examined for venereal disease. And so you don't have these individual people with their medical context. You have a population who is articulated in discourse as diseased. And so actually, as an example of the interplay of physical and metaphysical violence, in a response to sexual abuse reports, a colonial officer that was involved in this in the 1920s articulated that compulsory examination owes its origins entirely to the native wish and native conceptions as to how venereal disease measures should be conducted. In considering coercions, it is essential to divest one's mind of European conditions. Coercion is recognized as the customary method of introducing new ideas and advancing progress in this country, end quote. And so we see this nexus of all these different dynamics that are going on in that one example. So in order to move on to just the indigenous responses and reintegrating kind of Fanon's ultimate goal in a lot of his more famous works, we see that just as colonial medicine, as I've articulated it, may not constitute violence to the same degree that anti-revolutionary wars were brutally fought against indigenous Algerians, violence that is reactionary to colonial medicine does not need to be conducted as full revolution. So we can see resistance to the processes of medical discipline. If medicine is a sphere of colonial violence, then resistance to those can be a sphere of colonial violence that doesn't necessarily have to involve all-out counter-revolution or all-out revolution. And so my argument then is ultimately that resistance to colonial medicine, either through evasion or through practices of traditional medicine, which is something I hope to get more involved in my own research, is enunciative of counter-ontology or counter-epistemology. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone in the audience. I'm sure a number of you are eager to make a couple comments. I just wanted to say first that for those of you who don't realize, Ben Wise was one of the co-chairs who helped organize this entire program. You probably got emails from him. So now you see the brains behind all of the coordination. That quotation you have from Uganda is phenomenal. So yeah, well, you don't have to send it to me, but that's worthy of a whole kind of further analysis. We probably have time for 2 questions or so, short and sweet. Okay, I'll start with Dr. Bamako.
As I sat down here, I'm just trying to look at these young academicians, doing their own thing. And I can see a lot of promise in them. I'm just trying to figure out a kind of interaction between maybe all of them or some of them in such a way that I can make some few comments. The first observation that I want to make is that all of them are trying to present an alternative way of looking at reality in one form or the other, whether it is metaphysics or epistemology or politics. Well, the first question that I want to ask is that I have not read their papers, but I believe that what they are trying to reject and they are trying to provide on an alternative, they have actually made it known in the paper. And the reason why they are rejecting it. Somebody who is rejecting the Western paradigm of knowing, you must be able to tell us what is this paradigm of knowing, and where is it the case that you are rejecting it, and then the alternative that you are putting forward, how is it better than the one that you are trying to reject? And I think maybe that would be a good thing for you to do. In terms of the language, now somebody said, I think this is Jocelyn. No, not Jocelyn, this is Marianela. What cannot be said in one language or culture can be said in another language or culture. I don't know what that actually means, but maybe you are trying to move towards a kind of distinction that has been made between language and reality. And if it is the case that a particular language cannot capture reality as we expect, why is it the case that another language can capture reality more than the first one? And again, I can see also that the person that presented on a kind of Creole of Arabic and French. So if, for example, one language cannot capture reality, can the combination of two languages capture reality better than what one language cannot do? And I think maybe you can respond to that. You see, the last presenter, I think I'm so much impressed because I have learned a lot of things. For example, how he related physical violence, metaphysical violence, and psychological violence with the idea of colonialism. And the question is, what is metaphysical violence? That one, I'm not clear about it. I know of physical violence and psychological violence, but metaphysical violence, that one I do not understand. Thank you very much.
I think I'm going to pass this to one other individual. Maybe Farid can show us metaphysical violence. I don't know, as a practitioner. I was going to come to you, but you no longer want to participate. Okay.
Thank you.
I think Professor here will.
Thank you very much. I'll be. My question has to do with the presentation that's Marianela Muñoz, cultural revitalization. I'm interested particularly because in the area of culture, oral traditions and then African literature. And then this idea of Mayaya as a fertility right is one thing that I'm interested in. I'm aware of the fact that there are fertility rights that help to promote porno and promiscuity, so to say. I'm looking at regional peculiarities and differences, especially area of convergences and similarities. I'm also aware of the stereotypes, and therefore I'm trying to avoid, some of these pitfalls. Now, your advocacy for cultural revitalization, is it as a case of a culture for culture's sake, or as an end in itself, therefore, or a means to a definite end? So what are those elements that make indigenous festivals, for example, relevant today to warrant the magnitude of attention you are advocating in your paper? And again, for example, how is indigenous festival relevant to fighting, for example, anti-drug war? How does it help in psychic retrieval of the lost cultural values? And if I may ask, what values? So the purpose of this, my question, is to seek a set of second opinions, because I already have some answers. But yeah, that's one. And then any of the presenters can also help in this matter. And then secondly, for the presenter to consciously address some of these salient points raised through the questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. We have exactly 90 seconds left until you'll be able to talk amongst each other informally. So you have 30 seconds. I think you have 30 seconds, and maybe Ben has 30 seconds.
So start with them. I need to think into it.
You might allow a little bit more.
Well, I guess to respond to one of the first questions, which is this question of can one language represent reality better than another, or can a combination of languages represent reality? I do think that at least in the particular text I was talking about, and I think in many texts where you see extensive code switching, there are several examples in the North African context, but closer to us, there are also plenty of bilingual kind of Spanish-English texts as well. And I think it speaks to the question of, I was speaking with a professor recently, and he said, why do you have to choose, why are we still talking about speaking multiple languages like it's something exotic or interesting or weird or different? Why is this the exception when for many people it's the norm? And so I think that a lot of this in the literary context is almost trying to catch up with the reality of a vast majority of people for whom, multiple languages, that is how they think, that is how they see the world. And so in that way, yes, I think it is perhaps a better way of representing reality than one single language.
I'll respond to the question about just how I'm using metaphysical. I'm not using it in reference to any particular author's scholarship. I'm using it just kind of as a catch-all for seeding the implications of physical violence into what it does to a person psychologically. In my paper, and I could spend 30 minutes laying out the actual theoretical foundations of my paper, but I subdivide that into ontological in terms of how violence constitutes the being of people, and epistemological in terms of how it constitutes knowledge of a person or a group of people. So I'm just using it generally to display the transcendence of violence from the physical reality into the psychological, the existential, etc.
So you weren't talking about spiritual warfare. This is how I saw it.
So I think that is a part of my analysis, but I do think that the more specific subdivisions are ontological and epistemological. Yes.
An UNESCO intervention that presented to the Creole communities the option of revitalize what they wanted to revitalize. So here, what was very interesting is that the Creole communities say, we want to revitalize the maple, understanding that revitalize for UNESCO was to work in a 3 steps methodology, but also like a cycle of revitalization dynamics that implicates investigation, intergenerational transmission, and diffusion. But when we ask, why do you want to revitalize Maple? They says, because Managua, the capital, representations of Maple are stealing from us what Maple mean from us. So there was a political thing going on about boundaries, about cultural identity, when the community identified Maple at their own space, in private space, but because there were some things that used to happen in quarters, in families, that they were losing because Maple from Managua and from publicity was getting more popular, but that they own previous experience, and the opportunity of defining by themselves how they decide to play this game that Managua as a capital, mestizo, non-black, it was like orchestrating, kind of. And about the myth and about the values, we can speak about that.
Join me in thanking this excellent panel. Remember, you first saw them in Austin, so remember these scholars. I'm sure you'll hear from them again.